Decoupling was originally an independent detachment strategy for developing countries to get rid of the hegemony of developed capitalist countries according to dependency theory and world system theory. It also proposes an exclusionary decoupling proposition that it will definitely break away from close ties with specific countries with strategic competition in certain fields. This reverses the overall logic of detachment and decoupling theory in terms of subject, purpose, means and influence. The original intention of dependence and decoupling is to actively fight, be self-reliant, innovate, create and build the future, rather than deglobalization. The exclusionary decoupling advocated by anti-globalization in today's major power competition is not in line with the development trend of world history, and dependence and decoupling is not a reasonable choice for developing countries that is in line with the current reality. The decoupling and decoupling strategy should be considered flexibly and dialectically in light of historical conditions. In the 1960s, as soon as the decoupling strategy of dependency theory came out, it became a path concept for developing countries to get rid of underdevelopment and reverse the hegemony of developed capitalist countries under the current world system, and later became a representative proposition of world system theory. Accompanied by the serious contradictions caused by the deepening development of globalization, major developed capitalist countries have also shouted the slogan of decoupling in order to cope with the challenges brought about by the rise of developing countries, trying to categorically break away from certain countries with strategic competition relations. In order to maintain advantages, monopolize resources, and get rid of difficulties, it has become the main signboard of the anti-globalization trend of thought. Decoupling and decoupling are completely different from reverse globalization. The former is a strategy of self-reliance and innovative development for developing countries suffering from an unfair order, and it has a dimension of justice and progress. The essence of anti-globalization decoupling is exclusion, which excludes market entities that consider themselves strategic threats from the world system they dominate. This not only deviates from the general trend of world historical development, but also does not conform to the overall interests of the world system. It also confuses the understanding of the original meaning of decoupling, further exacerbating the misunderstanding of decoupling and decoupling. Analyze the quadruple logical inversion of the repulsive decoupling of anti-globalization and the independent decoupling of dedependence in terms of subject, purpose, means, and influence, and analyze the decoupling and decoupling strategies from different perspectives, and then clarify the true meaning of decoupling and decoupling. It is of fundamental, realistic, and strategic significance to see the dialectical strategy of the relationship between the transformation of developing countries and the developed capitalist countries and its realization possibility. 1. Reversal of decoupling logic, from detachment to anti-globalization. 1. Reversal of decoupling subject. The subject of detachment and decoupling is the weak party under the exploitative control of the capitalist world system, mainly the Third World, especially the southern countries, that is, the periphery of the world system. After World War II, developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have broken free from the slavery of the old colonialism and gained independence. They have shown strong power on the international political stage and continue to express their just demands of getting rid of dependence and developing independently. Symbolized by the non-aligned movement, developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have achieved preliminary development in their tentative practices as subjects of dependence and decoupling. Under the new round of globalization led by capitalism, developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have been more closely integrated into the world system, and the demands for dependence in real political and economic life have been objectively weakened. Some left-wing thinkers, social organizations, activist groups, and other popular forces around the world have turned into new subjects of contemporary dependence struggles, presenting broader and more diverse positive features. The World Social Forum and World Forum for Alternatives, which have been held continuously since the beginning of the new century, are typical platform mechanisms that include the above-mentioned new subjects. Although the new subjects of the practice of detachment and decoupling are relatively scattered in terms of power, facing a more severe environment and more complicated conditions, they have also produced new reasonable understandings in conjunction with the times. For example, decoupling and decoupling need to achieve in-depth coordination in different fields such as politics, economy, and culture, and broad recognition from all walks of life in the world. This is a difficult, slow, and gradual process. Decoupling and decoupling are not absolute, and should be explored and practiced flexibly and dialectically. The direction and steps, the theoretical design and practical struggle of detachment and decoupling should be promoted jointly, and so on. This shows that the struggle attribute of the new subject remains unchanged, but the strategy has been adjusted. The main body of the decoupling of anti-globalization is no longer weak countries and groups on the periphery of the world system, nor is it a broad and diverse mass force, but the leader of capitalist globalization, that is, the dominant party of the existing world system. The so-called decoupling issue in today's great changes in the world structure and world order is also mainly proposed and manipulated by the initiator of the anti-globalization movement, which is against the trend of globalization, and is repellent. A series of black swan incidents that have erupted in recent years have highlighted that vested interests in the current globalization order, such as the United States, are shifting from actively advocating globalization to actively instigating anti-globalization. Due to the crisis of their own systems and the inability to deal with the predicament of development, the governments and conservative politicians of some major Western countries rely on their control of the existing world order, relying on their own advantages of rule makers and vested interests. It monopolizes a large amount of international discourse power and social operation resources, manipulates international organizations, institutions, and groups, wins over dependent countries, influences the trend of international policy practice, guides the trend of global social thoughts and social movements, and suppresses and blocks the rise of developing countries to continue to maintain hegemony. Therefore, the subject of anti-globalization decoupling is injustice, intolerance and selfishness. 2. Reversal of the purpose of decoupling. The purpose of decoupling and decoupling is to change the unfair order of the current world system and break the hegemonic monopoly of developed countries on world development. It requires getting rid of dependent accumulation, resisting capitalist hegemony, achieving independent, fair and reasonable development, and opposing bipolarity differentiation as a value option. After World War II, with the help of multinational corporations and trade protectionism, a small number of developed countries led by the United States promoted neocolonialism. By controlling and manipulating the world economy, they hindered the healthy economic development of developing countries and further widened the economic gap between the North and the South. Developing countries of the Third World rely on independence and decoupling as their strategic support. At the Second Summit of Non-Aligned Countries and Governments in October 1964, they proposed the establishment of a new international economic order, aiming at safeguarding sovereignty and independence and opposing international exploitation, plunder, and control, and promote equality, mutual benefit, cooperation, and development among all countries. To this day, the construction of a new international economic order is still an important theme in international relations. The pursuit of independent development and freedom from dependence behind it is consistent across time and space, and does not fluctuate with the fluctuations of capitalist hegemony. The decoupling proposition of anti-globalization is the passive response of the capitalist world system to the crisis. It is used to alleviate the narrowing of the road of capitalist globalization and weak development caused by excessive accumulation, and has become the life-saving straw for reviving the country in the Western world. The most direct purpose of anti-globalization decoupling is to continue to maintain capitalist hegemony and its vested interests. With the rise of comprehensive national strength, increasing discourse power and expanding influence, the demands of developing countries to change the order of the world system are increasing day by day. In order to suppress this momentum, the major developed capitalist countries have used decoupling to return to themselves, instead of allowing developing countries to break with themselves and bringing them into the world system dominated by themselves to continue to squeeze benefits. They have turned to, in the face of risks and challenges, unilaterally prevent or restrict the activities of specific countries in the world system, actively decouple and break the chain with strategically competitive market players, and try to use this to compete for resources and the crisis. The essence is to use limited adjustments to cover up, deprive and tamper developing countries' demands for independence, fairness, and justice, and then intensify their hegemony and maintain the existing pattern of interests. 3. Reversal of decoupling means. For more than half a century, the detachment strategy has used theoretical criticism, political practice, and social movements as carriers to facilitate decoupling. As far as theoretical criticism is concerned, the world system theory and its prototype attachment theory, which came out in North America in the 1970s, have been committed to demonstrating the legitimacy of decoupling and exploring possible solutions. Both believe that the developing countries in the peripheral areas of the world system are the blood suppliers of dependent accumulation and the victims of capitalist globalization. A new world system dominated by socialism to get rid of dependence. As far as political practice is concerned, some third world politicians are actively advocating breaking away from the hegemonic order of world capitalism and getting rid of dependent accumulation, adding realistic feasibility to decoupling. Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias, the former president of Venezuela, and Fidel Castro, the Cuban revolutionary leader, are all critical of the capitalist-dominated world order and staunchly opposed to a bipolar world divided and hegemonic, has carried it through a political career that has been fruitful. As far as social movements are concerned, the multiple waves of anti-system waves in the Western world and the ongoing anti-globalization movement centered on global justice have all practiced the strategic proposition of detachment and decoupling from different dimensions for decades. The spirit, writing books, giving speeches, street protests, conferences, online protests, and the establishment of international organizations are different media for putting it into practice. 2. The decoupling means of anti-globalization are no longer academic, political, or popular methods such as the aforementioned theoretical criticism, political practice, and social movements, but are enforced through tools such as state machinery, policy mechanisms, and the right to speak out in public opinion. Single and rough, with unconventional, irrational, and even illegal. They use a generalized concept of national security and a series of related measures to impose economic and technological sanctions and containment on specific strategically competitive countries, trying to use exclusionary decoupling to get rid of their disadvantaged position in competition. In terms of economy, the policy of conservatism, populism, and trade protectionism began to be implemented, which led to turmoil in the international environment. Politically, due to the economic downturn, the major developed capitalist countries have begun to abandon their responsibilities in international exchanges and engage in unilateralism and isolationism. 3. In fact, it is a hasty response to the huge dilemma of the failure of its own democratic governance and the intensified crisis of democratic political legitimacy, which violates the natural logic of the benign development and transformation of the international order. 4. Reversal of decoupling effects. In the 1950s and 1960s, the world's national liberation movement flourished, and the idea of independence and decoupling resonated greatly in the Third World, especially the southern countries. The Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order and the Program of Action adopted by the Sixth Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly in April 1974 reflect the theoretical and practical influence of the decoupling strategy in a specific period. Constrained by the inherent structural defects of the center-periphery system, the attempts of developing countries to establish a new international economic order were quickly disintegrated by the new round of capitalist globalization led by developed countries. Since the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of a new round of globalization of capitalism has turned the concept of detachment and decoupling from a boom in a specific era into a silence and retreated more into ideological positions and scattered struggle actions. Decline in influence. However, the historical attempt of decoupling and its impact have not stopped abruptly. Many leftists around the world are still thinking about getting rid of the polarization and dependent development under the current world system, unremittingly promoting mass struggle and a new type of international joint. The decoupling proposition of reverse globalization is relatively rapid and powerful in terms of impact, and it is difficult to interfere with coercion. On the one hand, this is due to the fact that the originator has an absolute advantage in the world system, and the method of initiation is more direct, the purpose is more brutal, and the means are more brutal than before. On the other hand, the systemic crisis of capitalism has made major developed countries overwhelmed, and the rise of developing countries has strengthened the power to change the world system, so this is also a manifestation of hasty response to the situation. However, the appeal of the anti-globalization decoupling proposition is limited to the vested interests of the capitalist world system, and the scope of recognition is relatively narrow. In short, the essence of independence and decoupling is the idea of developing countries to independently solve their difficulties. It is a theoretical and practical attempt by the opposing party in the dominant aspect of the capitalist world system to resist the enslaving and exploitative order rules, and it is also a just appeal for the development of human society. Reverse globalization decoupling is a conservative move by the leading party of capitalist globalization to move against itself and perversely, resulting in the stigmatization of decoupling. This not only generalizes the concept of decoupling, but also makes it more difficult to achieve a decoupling strategy. To break free or coexist, different perspectives on decoupling paths. Dependency theory is the mother body of the decoupling strategy, and it is also the basis and embryonic form of the world system theory with decoupling as the main topic. Sorting out the conception of decoupling and decoupling paths based on different viewpoints in decoupling theory is a prerequisite work for comprehensively grasping the true meaning of the concept of decoupling and dialectically thinking about the realistic possibility of decoupling and decoupling. Featuring Gunder Frank, Theotonio dos Santos, Fernando Henrique Cardoso and Samir Emin among others. The main representative, dependency theory, started from safeguarding the interests of underdeveloped countries, and made a rich and in-depth analysis of the problems of dependence and dependence in the economic development of third world countries. They gave different plans to get rid of attachment, and decoupling is the general outline of their core point. One is the radical decoupling represented by Frank's underdeveloped development theory. Frank pointed out in his book Dependent Accumulation and Underdevelopment that underdeveloped development is rooted in the polarized contradiction between the sovereign country and satellite country in the capitalist world system. Based on this contradiction, the peripheral countries of the capitalist world system become less developed as they develop. The existing world system structure also makes it impossible for underdeveloped to become developed. For Frank thus formed his thinking on the issue of the attachment, that is, how to get rid of underdeveloped development. He concluded from the historical analysis of the economic development of Latin American countries that it is necessary to break away from the capitalist world system and completely break up the satellite country of the suzerain country in order to bid farewell to underdeveloped development. Frank's view that developing countries should take the road of independent industrial development in the capitalist world system and choose an economic and social development strategy suitable for their own countries is of great significance to the development of Marxist economics of underdevelopment, but from the perspective of the new round of world economy this is hardly feasible in light of the fact that we are more connected in the context of globalization. This shortcoming in Frank's discourse on decoupling has drawn many objections. Critics believe that Frank's independence and decoupling proposition is very absolute, one-sided, and radicalized. In the contemporary world economic structure, it is impossible for developing countries to completely cut off their economic ties with developed capitalist countries. Frank also realized this later, but the radical proposition of several decoupling has not changed. The second is the symbiotic utilization improved decoupling represented by Cardoso's dependent development theory. Brazilian economist Cardoso made an optimistic and unique vision of the path of dependence. He once published the article Dependence and Development in Latin America in the July-August 1972 issue of New Left Review. It is pointed out that the traditional attachment theory seems to put attachment and development in absolute opposition, and believes that there is no attachment without development, and that development must get rid of attachment, ignoring the possibility of the combination of the two. 5. He regards the development of attachment as a process of dynamic change, and believes that the contradictions of attachment and development can be combined. When peripheral capitalism develops to a certain extent, foreign capital, local state capital, and local private capital can find certain common interests, and thus link and combine them. Through the symbiotic utilization of dependence, the disguised decoupling of the exploitative order can be realized in a detour, which will benefit the social and economic development of developing countries. In the process of globalization from the 1980s and 1990s to the present, some developing countries in Latin America and Asia have indeed achieved development through this model. However, the dependent development theory has no more precise discussion on the competition and coordination relationship between different capitals, nor has it made a theoretical analysis or empirical investigation on how to further transition to a truly independent development. Developing countries taking the path of dependent development cannot change their internal dependent economic structure, and are still in essence appendages of the capitalist world system. Nor is this path a universal stage of development that is possible for all peripheral countries. This kind of fragile plan does not meet the standards and requirements of the dependence in essence. In the view of some scholars, it is more similar to a kind of seeking development independence, taking advantage of the dependence relationship between developing countries and developed capitalist countries, making an expedient measure for the further development of the economies of developing countries. 6. The third is the adjustment and transformation rational decoupling represented by Dos Santos' dependence theory. The Brazilian economist Dos Santos is an early developing country scholar who gave a comprehensive and detailed explanation of dependence. In his masterpiece Imperialism and Dependence, he pointed out that the concept of dependency emerged from discussions on underdevelopment and development in Latin America. Dependency is the condition in which the economy of some country is subject to the development and expansion of the economy of another country upon which it depends. A state of dependence results in a situation in which the dependent country is backward and exploited by the governing country. 7. Dos Santos' concept of attachment has four main aspects. First, dependency is not a concept of external factors, but a fundamental factor to explain the of developing countries, reflecting the internal structure of developing countries. Many scholars, including Dos Santos, have used this to criticize Frank's analysis of dependency that focuses on external factors. Second, attachment is a comprehensive and overall concept that includes politics, economy, culture, and many other aspects, and attachment is all-round. Third, dependency is both a manifestation and a reason for the persistence of unequal relations between developing and developed capitalist countries. Fourth, dependency has become a necessary structural element of the world capitalist system, and the world capitalist system is a system of dependency. The above understanding provides an important basis for Dos Santos to discuss the approach of decoupling. He believes that the methods provided by relevant organizations under the United Nations and some original economic organizations in the Americas are difficult to eliminate the reproduction feature of dependence. Only by fundamentally changing the internal structure and external relations of developing countries can they really get rid of dependence. Substantial adjustments have been made to the way it participates in the international system and the structure of the domestic economy. Dos Santos' adjustment change theory is more feasible than Frank's categorical separation theory, and the socialist revolution is a prerequisite for realizing change in his vision. However, this kind of proposition is relatively lack of clear planning, powerful measures, and flexible strategies, and the reality is not convincing enough. 3. The true meaning of attachment and decoupling from the perspective of Samir Emin. Different from the decoupling propositions of categorical separation, adjustment, and transformation, and symbiotic utilization, Samir Emin, a representative of decoupling theory, a well-known dependency theorist and world system theorist, proposed an autonomous and flexible approach to dialectical decoupling. Advocates that the reconstruction of globalization should be actively and moderately promoted through negotiations, and international inequality should be reduced through independent development. With the maturity of Samir Amin's theoretical thinking and the evolution of the world situation, these viewpoints have developed and become more targeted. Today's capitalist-led globalization is undoubtedly still dependent, but decoupling does not mean deglobalization, otherwise it will be confused with reverse globalization decoupling. Samir Emin pointed out that the dependence and decoupling never required a globalization. Not only does it not violate the historical law of the gradual integration and development of human society, but it will also help advance this process. 1. Detachment and decoupling are not helpless but active resistance. In this sense, detachment and decoupling are not retrogression, but progress. Decoupling is not a return to a self-sufficient economy, but a strategic reversal in the face of internal and external forces and the inevitable requirements for independent development. 8. From the perspective of the purpose of decoupling, it is to resist the center of the current world system, the relationship of oppression and exploitation under the peripheral structure, shaping a more reasonable world pattern, and pursuing a more equal world order of reasonable and legitimate. From the perspective of the motivation of the dependence and decoupling, the unequal development and its consequences brought about by the current world system are the direct cause. Conforming to the future trend of the development and evolution of the world system is the objective cause, and achieving independent development is the subjective reason, which embodies a kind of positive dimension. From the perspective of the subject of the dependence and decoupling, it is the active resistance of the exploited and oppressed masses, nations, regions, and countries on the periphery of the world system to the dominant power at the center of the world system, and their demands are just. 2. Decoupling is not self-enclosure but self-reliance. Samir Emin critically pointed out, in contemporary discourse, the concept of decoupling seems to have been replaced by deglobalization aid. As he once explained, when I first put forward the decoupling theory, scholars from the World Bank believed that it was a manifestation of a closed country in the new era. This interpretation method of Western scholars is naive and purposeful. They hope that people don't believe in the theory of decoupling. 9. In fact, decoupling never requires the rejection of globalization, and globalization, as an irreversible trend in the development of human society, can never be rejected. On the contrary, decoupling and decoupling should be active and restrained participation in globalization, so that external relations are subordinated to internal development, just order, but also to ensure their own necessary survival and development interests. This is the definition of decoupling, and some impatient readers confuse it with seclusion. 10. Samir Amin's vision of the future world is also to use socialism to reshape an alternative to globalization, rather than abandoning globalization. Objective process of transformation. Samir Emin particularly emphasized the openness of decoupling, and decoupling it requires countries to open up to the outside world and participate in global competition. It should be said that sovereign countries use the process of globalization to meet their own development needs, grasp development opportunities, and thus to achieve a gradual social change. Therefore, when we discuss the decoupling theory, we are using the process of globalization. On the one hand, Monopoly capitalism realizes the accumulation of capital and the expansion of global domination through globalization. On the other hand, we can also take advantage of the process of globalization to give priority to meeting the needs of national development. 9. On the level of technology and culture, Samir Emin also pointed out that decoupling is not at all synonymous with refusing to participate in the trend of science and thought in the world, only by actively grasping and guiding the direction of the world's scientific, technological, and cultural can we have the premise and foundation of self-reliance. The radical thoughts of nationalism or populism or the closed thinking of conservatism is a sign of crisis, not a way out, and it shows that society is powerless, at an impasse, and has not yet found a way to effectively link innovation with historical continuity. 11. How can we talk about self-reliance? 3. Detachment and decoupling are not starting from scratch but innovation and creation. The most direct proposition of detachment and decoupling is to get rid of the old world system and establish a new world system. This new world system will surpass the irrational order of the existing world capitalist system, but it will not simply start from scratch. The gestation of the new world system must come from the old, and the existing capitalist civilization is the realistic soil for the birth of the future world system. How to use the rational components of capitalist civilization to successfully establish a new world system is an extremely innovative and creative Simply starting a new stove is tantamount to a decisive break, ignoring the historical significance of capitalism, and discarding the beneficial achievements that capitalism has made in promoting the development of human history so far that can be used in the future. It will take unnecessary steps in the process of building a new world system. Detour. This idea of starting anew is also impossible to realize. On the one hand, because the historical development of human society is a continuous organic whole, it is extremely unrealistic to cut it off artificially, and it is impossible to create a new history out of thin air. On the other hand, the subordination of the existing world system one side does not have the realistic conditions to break with the ruling power at all, and the ruling power of the existing world system will never allow the subordinate party to separate in this way, so that the interests of the ruler will no longer exist. Therefore, the real meaning of decoupling and decoupling is based on the background of moderate globalization and asymmetric competition, actively cultivating the seeds of the future world system in the existing world system, and promoting the creation of the future world with innovative thinking and strategies in the real world. The history of the system. 4. Detachment and decoupling are not about burning jade and stone together, but building the future. Decoupling and decoupling is a constructive long-term strategy in terms of means and tactics. Detachment and decoupling can be broken and established, and it is based on practical thinking and practical efforts to be responsible for oneself and the future of human society. The so-called decoupling that only struggles without building is a chaotic and disorderly struggle, and a struggle of wisdom that is the direction of human civilization. Samir Emin once clearly pointed out, decoupling is to promote the reconstruction of globalization on the basis of negotiation, rather than succumbing to the exclusive interests of imperialist monopoly, and thus reduce international inequality. 8. Here as a key political means, negotiation highlights the path dependence of the dependence and decoupling aimed at fighting self-reliance and innovation. Negotiations are used to clarify the nature of the to rebuild the world system, and do not advocate resorting to military violence as a means of war. It can preserve the favorable aspects of the existing world civilization to the greatest extent, and provide benefits for the construction of the future world system. The kind of arbitrarily treating decoupling as almost becoming synonymous with absolute or relative closed door and withdrawing from commercial, financial, and foreign technological exchanges while ignoring its own narrow future orientation viewpoints do not conform to the true meaning of decoupling. 11. For decoupling and decoupling strategy, realistic possibilities and dialectical considerations. Questions about decoupling and decoupling have persisted for many years, and some believe that the theoretical foundation of the strategy is weak in the first place. The reasons are that, first, some original followers of the dependency theory began to believe that the basic viewpoints on which decoupling strategies such as unequal development theory and unequal international division of labor theory were based were not rigorous enough, and many demonstration cases had special tendencies in data analysis and selection, or even artificially set, causing controversy at the academic level of the dependence and decoupling strategy. Second, there has never been a consensus on the theoretical solution of the dependence and decoupling. While much has been discussed about it, scholars have provided few answers about the specific measures that will be used to achieve all of this. 1229. In reality, past country-specific practices of decoupling and decoupling were to some extent partial rather than complete, and some even failed completely. In particular, some countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa are mostly under the condition of a predictable cycle of violence, 1230 falling into a situation of intertwined wars and chaos, and eventually change regimes and change paths. In countries that have achieved relatively good results, mainly under the circumstances of blockade and exclusion, they are forced to achieve decoupling in some fields independently, such as science and technology, and when conditions permit, they reintegrate into the world system according to their own needs for development. Facts have proved that past decoupling and decoupling practices were at best partial and limited, and most of them chose to relink with the world market. With the development of the globalization process and the dilemma of its own theory and practice, decoupling and decoupling have hardly been formally discussed since the 1980s. It was only mentioned again in the competition among major powers under the background of today's anti-globalization, attracting new attention in the form of same names. The academic circles generally agree that the fact that the existing world system is unfavorable to peripheral countries has not changed in essence. At the same time, although the attention of the academic circles on the realization of the decoupling theory has weakened, the question to be answered has not been resolved in decoupling, and there is still a need for discussion 1230. The consensus reached so far is that the decoupling of anti-globalization is by no means a wise choice, and there are no realistic conditions for decoupling. Under this circumstance, the international order and international structure should be gradually adjusted, and the issue of decoupling should be re-examined. 13. Whether it is the independent decoupling of the dependence or the exclusive decoupling of anti-globalization, it is impossible to sever all relations, but to separate from at the strategic level and no longer maintain institutional division of labor relations. 14. But in any case, the pursuit of a fair and reasonable world order required by the independent development of the late developing countries will not change due to the current various staged conditions. Based on the complexity and diversity of historical conditions in developing countries, the possibility and feasibility of decoupling and decoupling need to be analyzed dialectically in combination with reality. Strategically, independence and decoupling should reflect the needs of developing countries for their survival and development interests. It will not resist the objective process of globalization, and will still work with the help of the objective process of globalization, and realize another better choice of globalization. Tactically, decoupling and decoupling require different measures depending on the circumstances of developing countries to ensure the realization of the strategic plan. From the comprehensive perspective of strategy and tactics, independence and decoupling is to use the objective process of globalization to create a new international order that is beneficial to the interests of developing countries. As Samir Emin puts it, decoupling is not a closed-door policy. Decoupling is a strategy that aims to make the relationship between peripheral countries and central countries subordinate to the logic and requirements of internal development. 15. The blind and heavy reliance on the world market aims to strengthen its own economic independence and resilience, and it is a more sensible choice to arrange its own element allocation more favorably to achieve structural transformation development path. 1228-29. Samir Emin made specific considerations on the realistic possibility of decoupling and decoupling strategies, including decoupling means, decoupling variables, and decoupling forms. One is to achieve the dependency and decoupling through political means of negotiation. This kind of negotiation is not asking for a price from the capitalist world system, and most developing countries do not have the strength to ask for a price. It is to use moderately aggressive resistance to fight for more for themselves under the current order through reasonable demilitarized struggle. Development resources. Even if these resources may not turn the situation around fundamentally, in the world system, the system optimization function of a key role will form a cascading effect within the system as the role itself gradually develops and becomes stronger, acting as an enzyme to exert strong pressure on the existing order. Until the time for a qualitative change in the existing order arises, a new world system and its corresponding new order pattern will be built along the way to achieve a natural effect. The greatest attention should be paid to this kind of growth internal change, that is, continuous and continuous change. 9. Such a process is full of difficulties and challenges, and it is relatively long, and it takes a long time to work, but the trend is certain. Therefore, the concept of dependence and decoupling cannot be generalized for different implementation subjects. It is necessary to combine different realities on the basis of ensuring the interests of their own survival and development, and emphasize flexible strategies to form a systematic joint force according to the situation. The second is to correctly understand the variable factors of the decoupling process. When using the political means of negotiation to promote decoupling, there is such a reality. For a big country, it can negotiate under more favorable conditions. For a weak country, its government may be in a coup d'etat. Overthrown, its country may be invaded, its border trade may be disrupted, and its terms of negotiation cannot be compared with those of powers. 15. This means that most developing countries are often very vulnerable due to their underdevelopment plight. It is not easy to make substantive progress on the issue of decoupling and decoupling. For these countries, decoupling can only be relative, and it depends on the negotiating power of the peripheral countries, their bargaining power, their economic, cultural and political advantages, and the degree of weakness or strength of the peripheral countries. 15. Based on this, negotiation strategies, comprehensive advantages, and firm will constitute the main focus of decoupling and decoupling subjects in strategic competition, while the absoluteness and relativity of decoupling and the different influencing factors of decoupling are variables that need to be carefully considered. Third, regional joint collective decoupling can be considered. Considering that only a few large countries in developing countries have the capital and strength to compete with the old order by relying on their own flexible, stable, solid and room for maneuver development, most of the rest are small and medium-sized countries. Samir M. Another way of thinking about detachment and decoupling is given. Taking Africa as an example, he pointed out, decoupling should take a collective form, and as far as Africa is concerned, it should take a regional form. The African region as a whole will form a negotiating force because it can provide extreme natural resources. It is impossible for people to invade the whole of Africa, and it is impossible to go to war in some parts of it. 15. This collective decoupling model of integrated development can create a favorable situation of sharing risks and doubling strength, which can effectively avoid the risk of war, can also jointly resist the many monopolies of world hegemony. Judging from today's world development trends, the practices of regional cooperation organizations dominated by developing countries, such as the African Union, the Arab League, ASEAN, the Latin American Community, and even the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, largely adapt to the above-mentioned ideas. Figure. These regional integration organizations actively participate in the current international order, express their own demands, protect development rights, and achieve independent development through regional alliances. At the same time, they integrate the concept of changing the world system into long-term future actions, and use more reasonable strategies and tactics to efforts to build a new world system. Especially in the areas needed for its own development, it actively seeks to integrate into the world system, and even competes for relevant dominance. 14. Instead of blindly and arbitrarily breaking out, it is more flexible and pragmatic. At the current historical stage, the vast number of developing countries still need to continue to enrich their own strengths and take effective development as the first priority. For this reason, it is necessary to truly understand the reasonable application of decoupling and consider its specific circumstances, not only to completely negate it from the perspective of radicalization, but also to consider it from a positive perspective of rational struggle, self-reliance, innovation and creation, and building the future, especially the difference between the exclusionary decoupling of anti-globalization and the autonomous decoupling of detachment in terms of original direction and authentic connotation can be beneficial.